The morning sun had barely risen when the headline appeared, a single sentence that shook the silence of trading floors across the globe. Burkina Faso signs $14 billion grain deal with India. To many, it sounded impossible. A landlocked nation in West Africa, long overlooked by the world, except for its gold mines and political struggles, was now at the center of a story powerful enough to send markets trembling from New York to Mumbai. Grain prices spiked within minutes. Analysts rushed to television studios, traders spilled their coffee in disbelief, and rival exporters in South America and Eastern Europe felt the ground shift beneath their feet. But the most striking reaction was not from the markets, it was from ordinary Africans who for decades had been told that their nations could never rise beyond dependency. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was writing a new narrative, and the opening words were bold. "Today, we are not just selling grain, we are shaping the future of Burkina Faso." This was not a simple transaction. This was a declaration of sovereignty, a message to the world that Africa could feed not just itself, but billions beyond its shores. Yet the questions remain. Why would India, already one of the largest food producers in the world, look to Burkina Faso? How did a country with no access to the sea manage to strike one of the largest agricultural deals of the decade? And what does this mean for Africa, for the United States, and for an unstable global food system shaken by climate change and conflict? Brothers and sisters, stay with me until the end of this story. Because what began as a grain contract may well be remembered as the dawn of a new economic revolution. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. It was still early morning in Asia when the news broke. The world's financial centers were only just waking up. New York traders sipping their first cups of coffee, London's brokers glancing at the day's opening charts when a headline flashed across global screens and shifted the rhythm of markets everywhere. Burkina Faso signs a $14 billion grain export agreement with India. The numbers were stark and undeniable. 20 million metric tons of maize and sorghum, $14 billion in value, 10 years of guaranteed supply. No slogans, no lengthy speeches, just 3 paragraphs in the official release. And yet those simple lines carried the weight of a geopolitical earthquake. Within minutes of the announcement, commodity markets jolted awake. In Mumbai, futures contracts for maize and sorghum surged. In Chicago, the world's grain hub, nervous traders scrambled to reassess their positions. London's financial analysts cut short their morning routines and rushed to trading desks. Grain prices rose sharply, fueled not by speculation, but by the raw realization that the global food map had just changed. Television studios lit up. Agricultural economists were ushered into live broadcasts. Words like historic shift and game changer filled the airwaves. The shock was not only that India, a grain giant in its own right, was suddenly turning to imports, but that Burkina Faso, a landlocked, politically turbulent nation, was stepping into the spotlight as a global supplier. For decades, Burkina Faso was known primarily for its gold exports, its cotton fields, and its struggles with poverty and instability. Few outside Africa considered it an agricultural powerhouse. Yet here it was claiming a share of the massive Asian market and positioning itself alongside exporters from South America and Eastern Europe. The announcement rebranded the country overnight. No longer merely a nation in the Sahel, Burkina Faso was presented as an emerging breadbasket, a country capable of feeding millions beyond its borders. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, this deal was not just about money, it was about recognition, dignity, and a place at the global table. Why would India, which already produces hundreds of millions of tons of grain each year, strike such a deal? The answer lay in security and foresight. India's food system depends heavily on the monsoon. When rains are good, warehouses overflow. When rains fail, prices spike and shortages erupt. By securing long-term imports from Burkina Faso, India was creating a climate insurance policy. West Africa's rainfall patterns differ from South Asia's, meaning that a drought in India does not necessarily coincide with poor harvests in Burkina Faso. In effect, New Delhi was diversifying its food supply, shielding its population from the unpredictability of climate change. The ripple effects of the deal were immediate and international. In Argentina and Brazil, exporters who had dominated Asian grain markets for decades saw a new competitor rising. In Ukraine and Eastern Europe, countries already reeling from war and disrupted trade routes felt threatened by this unexpected rival. For these established players, Burkina Faso's entry was not just symbolic, it represented a real challenge to their market share. Industry analysts warned of a coming price war as traditional exporters might lower prices or sweeten terms to protect their foothold in Asia. Despite the noise in markets, the official announcement itself was almost understated. No grand ceremonies, no sweeping rhetoric, just data tons, dollars, years. Yet sometimes it is precisely that simplicity that speaks the loudest. The absence of fanfare only heightened the sense of seriousness. This was more than a business contract. It was a strategy, a calculated partnership forged in trust and necessity. For India, it was about securing food and political influence in Africa. For Burkina Faso, it was about rewriting its identity and proving that even a landlocked country could shape global trade. And so, the world witnessed something extraordinary. In the dry heart of the Sahel, fields of maize and sorghum were suddenly not just crops, they were instruments of sovereignty. The ink on the $14 billion deal symbolized more than exports. It signaled to Africa and to the world that Burkina Faso was no longer content to remain on the margins. Today, we are not just selling grain, we are shaping the future of Burkina Faso. With those words echoed in every headline, the small West African nation announced its arrival on the global stage. The first wave was shock. The second was reaction. Within hours of the Burkina Faso-India grain deal announcement, the ripple had become a storm. Financial news networks went into overdrive. In Mumbai, anchors interrupted their scheduled segments with live updates. This is a turning point, one agricultural economist declared, as cameras zoomed in on flashing tickers showing maize and sorghum futures climbing higher and higher. In Chicago, traders stood shoulder to shoulder on the exchange floor, their voices rising above the noise as phones buzzed with urgent calls. London's brokers scrambled, their morning calm replaced by a flurry of panicked recalculations. Commodity charts lit up in red and green, signaling volatility. For years, analysts had assumed that only Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, or the United States could jolt global grain markets. Yet here it was, Burkina Faso, a country landlocked in West Africa, sending shockwaves across oceans. The louder responses came from rival exporters. In Buenos Aires, agricultural lobbies demanded emergency meetings with government officials. If India shifts even a fraction of its demand, Argentina's market share will shrink overnight, one grain union leader warned. In São Paulo, Brazilian soybean and maize exporters fretted. They had spent decades cultivating Asia as their primary customer base. Now, a competitor had appeared where none had been expected. In Kiev, still battered by war and struggling to keep exports flowing, the deal landed like a hammer blow. Ukrainian grain had long supplied Indian buyers. This threatens our recovery, a Ukrainian trade analyst admitted on live television. The anxiety wasn't limited to exporters. Middle Eastern importers observed carefully, wondering whether Burkina Faso might also supply their growing populations in the future. In Europe, some policy voices framed the agreement as evidence of a shifting world order where Africa no longer waited for permission but forged direct partnerships. Closer to Ouagadougou, the emotions were different. Across Burkina Faso, radio stations buzzed with discussions. Farmers in the Central Plains gathered around battery-powered radios, hearing their nation's name mentioned alongside India, Brazil, and Ukraine. "We never thought our sorghum could matter to the world," one farmer told a reporter. In neighboring Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mali, governments took note. If Burkina Faso could overcome its landlocked geography and enter global markets, why couldn't they? Editorials in West African newspapers began asking pointed questions. If Ouagadougou can build railways to ports, what excuse do we have? The deal ignited ambition across the region. The true climax of the story was not just numbers on paper. It was the moment the world recognized Burkina Faso as a serious competitor in food security. Global commentators labeled the deal the Sahel shock. Analysts compared it to the moment when Middle Eastern oil first flooded Western markets decades ago. For the first time in modern history, the global food system had to account for a landlocked African nation. Burkina Faso's grain was no longer just for local markets or regional trade, it had become a factor in global calculations. This was the emotional high point, the transformation of perception. From overlooked to indispensable, from margins to center stage. Yet the narrative was contested. Optimists called it a masterstroke, a partnership of equals that could stabilize global food supply. Skeptics dismissed it as fragile. How could a country without direct access to the sea truly deliver 20 million tons over a decade? Would corruption, poor harvests, or political upheaval break the promise? International outlets highlighted both voices, creating an atmosphere of suspense. Could Burkina Faso deliver, or would it stumble under the weight of expectations? Though Washington did not release a formal statement, American analysts privately admitted concern. The Chicago Grain Exchange, long considered a bellwether of world agriculture, was now reacting to African news in ways it hadn't before. For U.S. farmers, the question loomed: if India bought from Burkina Faso, would demand for American grain soften? The geopolitical undertone was unmistakable. Every trade deal carries politics, and this one whispered of a future where Africa was no longer a passive participant, but a strategic actor capable of shifting global balances. Above all, the reaction revealed emotion: pride in Africa, alarm in South America, curiosity in the Middle East, suspicion in Europe, concern in America. What bound them together was one undeniable fact: Burkina Faso could no longer be ignored. The announcement was no longer just a headline. It was a climax, a story unfolding with drama, uncertainty, and the promise of transformation. The world was watching. The ink on the $14 billion agreement was barely dry when the deeper questions began to surface. If Burkina Faso was to become a global grain supplier, what would that mean for its own citizens, its politics, and its place in the African continent? For ordinary Burkinabé, the first concern was simple: will there still be enough to eat for us? It was a valid fear. A country that exports millions of tons could risk shortages at home if profits outweighed people's needs. The government anticipated this anxiety. The deal included strict safeguards: a fixed percentage of national grain production reserved for domestic consumption, untouchable even if world prices skyrocketed; a share of revenue dedicated to subsidizing local food prices and funding irrigation projects, ensuring long-term productivity. By embedding these protections, Ouagadougou sent a message: the deal was not a betrayal of its people, but a plan to grow both exports and local supplies simultaneously. Still, the true test would come in practice: whether promises translated into grain on tables in villages from Bobo Dioulasso to Kaya. For farmers, the implications were profound. India pledged not only to buy grain, but also to invest in Burkina Faso's agricultural infrastructure. This meant modern storage silos to reduce post-harvest losses, irrigation systems to make farming less dependent on rainfall, training programs introducing new techniques and technologies. The impact stretched beyond economics. In the Central Plains, young farmers who once dreamed of leaving for Europe now began to see agriculture as a path to dignity and income. The countryside, long seen as a place of poverty, was being reframed as the engine of national pride. The logistics challenge: Burkina Faso's landlocked geography had always been seen as a curse. Suddenly, it became a catalyst for investment. Together, India and Burkina Faso agreed to co-fund upgraded rail lines connecting Ouagadougou to coastal ports in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, expanded road networks linking rural farms to export hubs, increased storage capacity in regional ports. These projects went far beyond grain. They promised new jobs, faster trade for other sectors, and stronger ties with neighboring countries. Infrastructure in this sense was not just engineering, it was diplomacy binding West Africa together in shared opportunity. Domestically, the government reaped political dividends. For decades, Burkina Faso's leaders had been portrayed as fragile, dependent on foreign aid, or overshadowed by instability. Now, under the banner of this deal, the state projected an image of strength and vision. By choosing India, a partner offering investment without heavy political conditions, Burkina Faso asserted its sovereignty. Unlike Western powers who often tied trade to military or governance reforms, New Delhi framed the relationship as equals at the table. For a nation historically constrained by colonial legacies, this was a symbolic victory. The civil and political consequences were not limited within national borders. Across West Africa, leaders faced mounting pressure from their own citizens. If Burkina Faso can negotiate fair terms, why can't we? The agreement lit a fire of expectation. It challenged African governments to prioritize food exports, infrastructure, and independence from Western tutelage. In this way, Burkina Faso's decision carried a political charge that extended across the Sahel and beyond. Yet, alongside optimism, risks loomed. Climate shocks could derail production. Corruption or mismanagement could siphon off revenues. Political opposition might exploit domestic food price fluctuations to weaken the government. International rivals might seek to destabilize such a bold experiment. The civil political consequences were therefore double-edged. The deal offered dignity and development, but also exposed Burkina Faso to greater scrutiny and vulnerability. For now, pride outweighed fear. Citizens saw themselves no longer as victims of poverty, but as contributors to global security. In dusty towns and fertile valleys, the message echoed. Burkina Faso was no longer only the land of cotton and gold, it was now a grain nation with political weight. The true consequence of the deal was not just measured in dollars or tons of maize, but in the transformation of identity. A people who had long been told they were weak now saw themselves as actors in history. The $14 billion grain deal did not just alter trade flows, it forced the world's major powers to rethink their assumptions about Africa food security and sovereignty. In Washington, the reaction was cautious. Official statements were muted, but the unease was clear in financial circles. For decades, the United States has prided itself on being a dominant grain supplier, with Chicago as the beating heart of global commodity trade. Now, the Chicago Board of Trade was reacting not to U.S. weather reports or South American harvests, but to headlines from Ouagadougou. American analysts voiced two concerns: market influence. If India turned increasingly to Burkina Faso, U.S. grain exports could face declining demand in Asia, undercutting America's leverage. Geopolitical significance. The deal symbolized a growing trend of African nations choosing non-Western partners, bypassing Washington's influence. Though no public confrontation emerged, the whispers in think tanks carried weight. Was the U.S. witnessing the erosion of its agricultural and political dominance? In Brussels, the European Union struggled with ambivalence. On one hand, officials applauded any move that diversified global food supply and reduced reliance on volatile exporters like Ukraine. On the other, they worried that Africa's new assertiveness might weaken Europe's long-standing influence on the continent. For decades, European aid programs had been tied to agricultural development in Africa, often under paternalistic frameworks. Burkina Faso's success in negotiating a deal of equals with India directly challenged that model. Some European commentators admitted reluctantly that the age of dependency politics was waning. China, already deeply invested in African infrastructure and agriculture, watched with a mix of curiosity and competition. Beijing had long championed South-South cooperation, but New Delhi's move signaled that India too was ready to claim leadership in Africa. Analysts in Beijing framed the deal as the start of a quiet rivalry between Asia's two giants for African partnerships. In the Middle East, import-dependent nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE viewed Burkina Faso's breakthrough with interest. If the Sahel could supply India, why not the Gulf? Editorials in regional media speculated that West Africa might soon become the next frontier of food security contracts. Beyond individual powers, the world saw the Burkina Faso-India deal as a marker of multipolarity. For decades, food trade was concentrated in the hands of a few exporters: the US, Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine. Smaller nations were rarely part of the equation. This agreement broke that mold. It sent a symbolic message: in an age of climate change and geopolitical tension, even landlocked nations could rise as strategic players. That symbolism resonated across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Anywhere countries were looking to reduce dependency on traditional Western suppliers. Global experts distilled three key lessons from the deal. Diversification is survival. Nations can no longer rely on a single region for food imports. Infrastructure equals independence. Without railways, ports, and silos, no country, no matter how fertile, can compete globally. Respect matters. Partnerships built without political strings endure longer and inspire more trust than those framed as dependency. Perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. For the first time, policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Riyadh had to treat Burkina Faso as more than a peripheral state. Its fields of maize and sorghum were now entangled with their economies, their food systems, and their political strategies. The deal was more than an African success. It was a reminder to the world: sovereignty, when defended with vision and trust, can transform even the smallest nations into global actors. From a single headline at dawn to waves of debate across continents, the $14 billion grain deal between Burkina Faso and India has already proven itself to be more than trade. It is a statement, a declaration that even nations once dismissed as marginal can redraw the lines of global power. But with opportunity comes risk. Can Burkina Faso deliver 20 million tons without compromising the food security of its own people? Will infrastructure investments arrive on time, or will delays weaken trust? And in a world where climate shocks, political instability, and market volatility are constant threats, can this bold promise truly endure a decade? These questions are not just for Ouagadougou or New Delhi. They are for all of us. Because if a landlocked African country can suddenly shape global food prices, then the balance of power is shifting before our eyes. This is not just Burkina Faso's experiment. It is a test for the future of multipolar trade for Africa's sovereignty and for how the world adapts to new realities. Brothers and sisters, history has given us a rare moment. The maize and sorghum fields of Burkina Faso are now woven into the destiny of billions. What happens next will either inspire a generation or serve as a warning of what could have been. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet, or is this only the beginning of a greater gamble? Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines.